Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Okay, I see it is 5:30. President Hamada, if you'd like to kick us off.
Yes, welcome everyone to our work session. And I think I will turn this over to our interim superintendent to introduce our guests.
Thank you so much, President Hamada. Pleasure to be here. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to invite Mr. Paul Brockvogel, our Executive Director of Legal and Labor, to introduce our guest. Great to see our guest again, and so I'll turn it over to him. Paul.
Thank you, Interim Superintendent Bale. This is Buzz Porter from the Porter Foster Rorick firm. Buzz has been a support in the legal community for a number of years, running his firm, and represents a large number of the school districts, and I believe has had significant experience over the years in municipal practice. So he's uniquely qualified to present to you tonight on the PRA and OPMA matters. And we'll touch, I think, a little bit on the ethics statute and some of the other things that we have intended to touch on briefly, but also dive in deeper on the 29th, or at least at a later date that we can have more time. So with that, I'll turn it over to Buzz, and he will be presenting on the PRA and the OPMA.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to quickly share screens here so we can get our PowerPoint up and running. There we go. Make sure I can still see all of you. Okay. So as Paul mentioned, my name is Buzz Porter. I'm an attorney with Porter Foster Rorick in Seattle. We're a small law firm that specializes in representing school districts. At last count, we were currently representing, I think, 105 school districts in the state of Washington out of the 295. That's all parts of the state except in the Spokane area is about the only area that we're not currently practicing. This is a presentation tonight, a lot of material that I have been sharing with boards around King County, Kitsap County, on a regular basis, on an annual basis in many cases. But we always make sure that we update it. The latest and greatest in terms of changes in the law or cases get mentioned as well. The only other piece of introduction that's really important for me to mention is that I'd much rather answer the questions you actually have than just the ones I'm guessing that you have. So our presentation is really based on what we're guessing you wanted to know. But if you have a specific actual thing that you wanted to ask a question about, please speak up and say so. I enjoy the challenge of answering your questions and getting back to our outline as quickly as possible. So please feel free to interrupt at any time. Say you've got a question. I'd be happier to go deeper into anything that maybe we're just touching on a slide or in the written information. I have provided a full written handout in addition to the PowerPoints, different than the PowerPoint slides. They follow and go along together, but I find that PowerPoints are a visual tool. They're not necessarily an educational tool. And so that's why I provided a separate handout with a lot more detail that you could actually take away and read in more detail any specific thing that I'm talking about. For that, any quick questions before I get started? I don't see anyone speaking up, so I'll jump right ahead. There are 6 areas we're going to try to cover tonight.
Mr. Porter, just one moment. I do want to apologize, but I want to explain to our audience that we are virtual tonight completely with our entire board, not because we don't want to be in person, but because of health regulations that we need to be on virtual tonight. And I want to have a sound check. My board directors I'm seeing in chat are having trouble with their audio. How are we doing, everybody? I don't see Michelle on there again. Did she go in and out? Joe, could you give us a thumbs up if you have sound?
I'm good now. I had a restart. Apparently there was an update. So yes, so she probably had to do the same.
Tim, are you okay? Can you give us a thumbs up?
I'm fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. All right. Director Farah.
Yes, I'm good. If you guys can hear me.
Thank you. And Director Bettinger. Can we wait just a few minutes to see if we can get her in the beginning, unless you think differently? I want to make sure everybody has equal access here. So if anybody's got a good story, I'm going to wait just a few minutes here. I'm sorry, Mr. Porter, to interrupt you.
No problem.
Leslie,
Yes.
if I can, you'll recall at a previous board meeting, I announced my filing for the Kcda position on board of directors, and which I did do. I just want people to know that those notices will be coming out shortly, and it requires our board members to actually vote as an individual. And I'd appreciate your support.
Thank you. I think we do have to keep strictly to an agenda that's posted, though, for our audience, if I'm correct. We can tell a story maybe that has nothing to do with anything.
You are correct. In a special meeting like this, we are limited to the agenda.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Just for future reference. No biggie. You know, we're all friends here. You know, just we want to follow the rules. I certainly know I've made mistakes all the time. So, Miss Director Bettinger, are you there at all? Well, I don't want to take too much time. I think we're just going to have to go on. She has the handout unless other directors want to wait. Okay, I can hear you. Could you speak to me, Director Bettinger, so I know you have sound?
I have sound. Finally.
Excellent. We waited for you. I want to make sure everybody
Thank
has
you. I appreciate it.
equal access. So, Mr. Porter, if you will please continue.
I will do so. So there are 6 separate areas we're going to try to cover tonight. Some will take longer than others. The first we're going to deal with is the Open Public Meetings Act. Something we were just mentioning a moment ago was, what can we do or not do in a particular type of meeting? That'll all be covered in the OPMA part. Then we'll discuss the Public Records Act, which is related, and it's another sort of form of open government legislation that was passed about the same time as the Open Public Meetings Act. Both are the early 1970s here in Washington when we adopted those. Then we will discuss the records retention requirements, which is sort of the other side of the coin from the Public Records Act. The public can get access to records, but unless we had an obligation to retain them, there wouldn't be any records to ask for. So that's the third act we'll talk about. I'll then transition into talking about conflicts of interest, which is a significant ethics area for school board members to make sure we review. And then there's another statute that has a really fancy title. It's just called Other Prohibited Acts, a very specific statute, 4223070. They wasn't passed actually until the early 1990s, and it deals with some things that people would have thought had been in the law forever. And I think in the common law, perhaps they were well understood, but they were not written down into a statute until the early 1990s. And we'll go over those as well. Then the last category I'll cover are some other sources of ethical duties that aren't necessarily written down in part of the revised Code of Washington. So it's not something our legislature has adopted, but there are other ethics rules that you need to be aware of as a board member. So those are the 6 areas we're going to cover. I'll do them one at a time and probably take a pause between each one. As I mentioned before, please feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. I like that I can see most of you on the screen. Just raise your hand. I'll keep an eye for you there. And if you want to say something, I'll be happy to answer a question at any time. So starting with the first topic, the Open Public Meetings Act, first one we're going to talk about. And the first rule is that school boards must conduct their business in the open. That's the broad rule. That's really why the act exists. But what does that mean, to conduct your business in the open? To try to explain that to you, the first thing that you must know are there are sort of 3 key phrases, 3 words: action, and the action must be conducted at either a regular or a special meeting. And I think it's a very basic thing that all municipal officers in Washington, particularly school board members, should understand those 3 words. What does it mean when we say action? What does it mean to be a regular meeting? What does it mean to be a special meeting? Regular meetings are ones in which you have set forth a schedule in advance. And districts can either do it through a board policy or through a resolution. You can say, these are going to be our meetings for the next year. We're going to meet every other Tuesday, or the 2nd and 4th Tuesday, or the 1st and 3rd Monday, or we will, in some small districts, they meet once a month. They meet the first Wednesday of every month, and that's the only time they meet. And that's their regular meeting schedule. And it's set forth either in a board policy or in a resolution for that year. And when you know in advance, basically that's when you're going to be meeting. The public knows that they could show up at that period of time when that was when that was listed as being the regular meeting time, and they would see a meeting if they wanted to see it. Because it's a regular meeting, it has to be held within the district's boundaries. You're not allowed to hold regular meetings outside the school district boundaries. And recently, just within the last 5 years, they passed a new rule that you have to post your agenda for your regular meetings 24 hours in advance. They did not change the rule, however, that you're not limited to what's on that agenda when you come to that meeting. So you can add anything to the agenda, even if it's less than 24 hours. Even if it's just you that night in the middle of the meeting decide there's some other topic you want to talk about and it wasn't on the agenda that you pre-published to the world, you can still do it if it's a regular meeting. You're not limited to what's on the agenda. You just have to let everybody know what you were planning to talk about. And you can always talk about things that were not planned. That posting of the agenda, because this was a recent law, they actually said it's done on the internet, unless you're a school district that doesn't have a website. I don't think we have very many of our 295 in the state that don't, but if we did, they wouldn't have to publish it on a website, they would do it physically. Looks like Director Hamada, I think I see a hand up for you. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I have a hard time with understanding what the term action means here. What is your definition of action?
Yeah, when people think of the word action in terms of a school board meeting, they think taking action would be like taking a vote. That's not the definition. In the statute, they wrote out a much more specific definition, and it includes any discussions or deliberations over official public business. And if you think about those terms, discussions or deliberations, that's very broad. That's deliberating, that's having a conversation about district business. That counts as action. Of course, votes also count as action, but people don't usually think about the discussions and deliberations also count as action. So you can only have action at a regular or special meeting. Director Clark.
All right, so I'm a little troubled with the broadness of that definition, so I'm going to throw out a specific. Let's just say that the board has been facing difficulty with housing of students, and they're looking at moving the 8th grade up to the high school. Now, that obviously has a significant impact on all kinds of things. And the investigation of that is going to require a monumental amount of information gathering. So at what point do we start worrying about whether that has to be under the definition of action?
It's when the governing board is doing it. This is a law that applies to the governing board. It applies to the 5 of you. So when the
Okay,
5 of you
all right, time out.
Go ahead.
All right. So I fully understand conversations when there are 3 or more of us present. But
Yep.
if I'm talking to a Wally and he has a child that's going to be caught in that circumstance, and my wife is an elementary school teacher and she knows this impact. Information sharing is critical to arrive at a reasonable resolution. So I still don't understand whether it isn't appropriate for us to be talking to each other about these issues.
So a couple of clarifications I can give you there. The first is that it only counts as a meeting, and it only has to be done in a regular or special meeting if there are a majority of the board members, 3 or more of you involved. If you were a 7-member board, it would take 4, but because you're a 5-member board, it takes 3 of you to be considered a meeting. If there's only 2 of you discussing something, it's not considered a meeting and it's fair game. So 2 of you can go off and talk about anything you want. Not that it's a good thing to do, but you could. It doesn't violate anything in the Open Meetings Act for 2 of you to have a discussion about it. But if we want all 5 or 3 or more, that's all it has to be, but usually it's all 5, to have a conversation together about a topic, that has to be done at either a regular or a special meeting. So it can't be something that you do outside of a meeting. Because if we want to provide information to you, say the superintendent has some recommendations. You were talking about an example of perhaps changing the grade levels assigned to certain schools, and he wants to make a recommendation. He would do that if he wanted you to all discuss it together. It would have to be at a regular or special meeting. And that's so the public can watch you do that deliberating and discussing. They don't want you to do that in secret. That's what they were trying to get rid of in the 1970s, was the backroom deals. And so they wanted the public to be able to watch you have these conversations, not just take the vote on it, but actually have the conversation. But again, it only counts if there are 3 or more of you. See a couple of other follow-up questions. I think I saw yours first, Director Bento, and then I saw Director Bettinger's.
Yeah, thank you. So I had a question. Because you mentioned that if we were meeting day of, we could add things to the agenda. In past, we were told that we couldn't do that. So we developed like a form to, like, if we wanted to add things to the agenda. So technically that's not necessarily required unless we want to do something ahead of time, or like, I'm trying to figure out, like, is that something that's needed, or is that something that's going to be just more paperwork, or like, I'm trying to figure out, is that a necessary step, you think?
So it's not required for a regular meeting. It is required for a special meeting. Special meetings, you cannot add a topic less than 24 hours in advance. So for example, tonight's meeting is a special meeting. It wasn't part of the regular schedule that had been published for the year. So tonight we're limited to only discussing things that were on the agenda that was published 24 hours in advance. And if you wanted to add something, it had to be added 24 hours in advance. A regular meeting doesn't have to follow that rule. It doesn't mean it's a good idea to keep adding things all the time at the last minute. And that's why a lot of districts will have a practice, usually actually 3 or 4 days in advance, of closing off the agenda and not adding things. But that's a local decision. And even those districts that have that practice of trying to get everything, to the board members so they can feel prepared and read everything in advance, so they get it 3 or 4 days in advance, even those districts find occasionally there are emergency things that come up on that day that they want the board to consider, and they will make exceptions to add things at the last minute.
And that just takes whatever parliamentary procedure we use to add something to the agenda, like the day of.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, in many places it's done as part of it, actually on the agenda. One of the first things the board votes on is to adopt the agenda for the day. And if anybody wanted to add anything, that would be the parliamentary point in time to do it, when the board adopts the agenda at the beginning of the meeting. Not every district does that, but many do. Director Bettinger, looks like you had a question as well.
Yes, and just maybe to give some history to Director Beno, is that there was some time where it was difficult for some directors to get items on the agenda at all. So that's where I think we got told that because we were having trouble getting items on the agenda. So historically that, kind of going back to Director Clark's question, I guess my question is, can you talk about serial meetings? Because I'll being completely frank and transparent, that has been a struggle for me on this board, because sometimes I think there have been serial meetings where it's like people have discussions or they decide to vote a certain way before a meeting. And it's happened my entire time on this board. So I just, maybe a discussion on what constitutes a serial meeting.
Yeah. So to try to give the context on that, the concept of serial meetings goes back to some court cases, actually comes out of the state of Florida in the late 60s. And it was some court cases. I don't know if they involve school districts or other municipal entities, but it were questions about they had an Open Meetings Act like we do, but they had an elected official who would call, back in the day of just we had telephones, who would call a second board member, have a conversation, and then that board member would call a third board member and report what happened in the first conversation, who would then call the fourth board member, who would then call the fifth. So they weren't all talking at the same time on the same phone line. However, they carried the conversation from one to the next. And the court said that violates their Open Meetings Act because it was called a serial meeting. It was a way for the board to have a conversation. They were basically getting around the act by not putting three of them in the same room at the same time, but having the conversation, and said that also violated the act. Our state adopted, when we adopted our Open Meetings Act, something that mirrored the Florida statute. And so our courts have followed those same principles to say that serial meetings here in Washington would also be a violation of the Open Meetings Act. And one of the specific cases we had that established that was actually brought against the Battleground School District. I think it was a decision that came out in 2000. The year 2000 is when it came out. And they applied it not necessarily just to phone calls, they applied it to email in that particular case, where you had one board member who emailed a second board member who then emailed a third board member. And the carrying of the conversation that way to three different board members was the same as if they had been in the room together. And so the court said that would violate the act, that serial conversation. And so that's one of the reasons we honestly discourage board members from having email conversations with one another, because it is so easy for somebody to hit reply all. And once you do that, once you hit reply all, that then is now a conversation amongst the five of you, and you have violated the Open Public Meetings Act. Technically, there could be an email conversation between two of you, and as long as it was just the two of you, that would not violate the act. But once there's a third person, either because they got forwarded one of the earlier emails or because the three of you were all having that conversation together, that would violate the act. It does mean we do often do what I call one-sided emails. We send a lot of things via email to board members, but we ask you not to reply, and particularly don't hit reply all. So you can receive things. And so that's often the way many superintendents like to keep their boards updated and involved, by sending a lot of things to all five board members at once using email. But we have to ask them to please don't hit reply all and do that conversation. Now, I would say if you want to get really technical about serial meetings, to constitute a serial meeting, you have to be sharing the information from that first conversation in a second conversation with a third board member. That sounds really technical, but in theory, let's say Director Clark could have a conversation with Director Bettinger, where they talk about, I think your chosen topic, Director Clark, was, reassigning grades to different schools. Use that as the example. And he has a conversation with Director Bettinger about it. He could then have the same conversation with Director Bento, but not mention anything that Director Bettinger said. He could just have a one-on-one conversation with Director Bento as well. That would not violate the act for Director Clark to have individual conversations with each of you one-on-one, as long as Director Clark did not share the information that Director Bettinger gave him. So if he went to Director Bento and said, "Do you know what Director Bettinger said?" All of a sudden, that's now three of you sharing the information, and that needs to be done at a regular or special meeting so the public can watch you have that conversation. That's splitting a lot of hairs, I get that, but that's technically how the serial meeting rule would work. Director Hamada.
Yeah, and I think that pretty much explains that. This is another thing that I've struggled with. I think I get the email part of it, but again, if I want to call somebody and talk to somebody about somebody, and then I want to call somebody else and talk to them. But if I'm not repeating all the things that were said in the first conversation, to the second conversation or the third conversation. If it's a fresh new conversation, then that does not constitute a serial meeting. Am I correct?
Correct, as long as you don't share information from that first conversation during the second conversation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Hopefully that's not considered a gray area for anybody, but that is splitting hairs pretty narrowly. And it's actually one of the reasons why board members are very careful about the conversations they have with one another, because they don't want to violate that particular rule.
Buzz,
Paul,
while
I
we're
saw
on
you
this
turned your
topic,
camera on
maybe
there.
I
Do you
can,
have something you want to share?
this is Paul. Whenever I turn my camera on, the thing cracks up. So I'll just keep this brief. Our board policy allows for some latitude when board members want to put something on the agenda. And maybe you can speak to that. Say, for example, President Hamada gets a call from Director Bettinger who wants an agenda item, and then she also gets another call, that's unsolicited, or maybe it's solicited. So you have three people talking about an agenda item, but not the substance of it, and whether that's authorized. Because I think there's going to be some frustration if we get too worried about it. And I know there's a rule on that, and I was asking maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, two things I can say there. One, the development of the agenda itself is not covered by the Open Public Meetings Act. How you decide what to put on an agenda, that's completely a local decision. Some districts, most of them will have some process where the board president is involved, usually with the superintendent, and coming up with that agenda. And then when you get to the meeting, the other 4 board members can decide we don't like that agenda and add anything they want. So the process you use to develop an agenda is very much a local decision. This rule about the Open Public Meetings Act would allow the president to talk individually with the other 5 board members about something on the agenda, what they wanted on the agenda, as long as the president doesn't share what the other board members said. Doesn't say, well, I know that 2 board members don't want this because I just got off the phone talking to them and they don't want that on the agenda. Once you start having that part of the conversation, that's when you'll violate the rule. But if you had each board member talk individually with the board president about what they wanted on the agenda, and the board president is not sharing what the other board members think about that, we don't have 3 board members having a conversation at that point in time. Okay, believe it or not, we had all of that conversation because of 3 words: action, regular, and special. Action must be at a regular or a special meeting. Now, those are really key words, but it really is the foundation of that entire statute. Can be summed up in that one sentence. All action must be conducted at a regular or special meeting. There is a lot more to talk about with the Open Meetings Act, though. So why do we even have it? We care about action and regular and special meetings because the public must be allowed to attend. That's the impact of this act, is that we cannot go in back rooms and be cutting secret deals anymore. The public must be allowed to attend. But what does that mean? Because occasionally, and we've seen a lot of this within the last 12 to 18 months, the public can attend and make it so that the board can't do its business. If a group of people becomes disorderly, the board at that point is allowed to clear the room and to continue its meeting without the public there. That's only if a group is being so disorderly that they make having a meeting impossible. I had really never seen that until the last 18 months. It almost never happened in Washington school districts until recently. So that's something that we've been consulting on quite a bit just in the last 18 months. Allowing people to attend is different, I need to point out, than people having the right to speak up at that meeting. And that surprises folks, but the law actually does not give the right to anybody except the board members to talk at a board meeting. There is no right to have a public comment. There are a few special statutes that deal with certain topics that say you have to have a public hearing, like when you adopt your budget every year. There's a separate statute that says before you adopt the budget, you have to have a public hearing. And there you would have to allow people to come and speak to you about it. But generally, at just a regular meeting where you're not dealing with that kind of a topic, you don't have to allow anybody to speak up. It's a meeting of the board. I will say it is virtually universal, however, in Washington state that all boards do have a public comment period because they want to hear from the public. They want an ability to engage their public. And this is when all 5 board members can hear the same thing at the same time. So almost every board has adopted a procedure locally that allows for public comments, but that is what it is. It's a local procedure. It's a local decision. It is not required by the Open Public Meetings Act that you allow public comment. We can't require people to register to attend. So to come and sit in the meeting, I can't make them give you their name or their address or anything. But because you do control public comment, you can condition their comment on them identifying themselves. And I do have some districts who have that procedure that they want people to actually sign up and tell us who you are, where you live, do you even live in our school district before you give a comment to us. That's a local decision, not required by the statute. So that's the second big piece of the Open Meetings Act of what it means to be open. We have action at a regular or special meeting, and we have to allow the public to attend. The third piece of being open, what does it mean to be open, is we cannot take votes by secret ballot. Hopefully that's nothing that you even come close to doing, but I will tell you where it gets tempting to do is when we talk about the next subject, which are the exceptions of when can we go into an exec session and not do something in the open. Sometimes it's tempting to some boards to want to take the temperature of the other board members in an executive session. And that's not permitted. We can't be doing secret ballots, which means when you're in an exec session, that's why we don't take votes in an executive session. That would be prohibited. And I've seen that that's when it becomes tempting to do this, often innocently, not because somebody's trying to get around the act, but because we're trying to move forward with a consensus on a decision. And people want to know, hey, what does everybody think about this? You just have to be really careful. You're not doing it by some secret ballot and saying, everybody, let's vote on this in executive session. Anybody have questions about that particular rule? Okay.
Buzz, maybe I can ask you.
Yeah,
Mr.
sorry.
Mr. Porter, I'm not sure this is the right place to ask that, but when we have, this is a whole different, but it is about talking about voting. And one of the things, I'm going to be very open, that in the past, when we were getting into talking about evaluations of superintendents and contracts, do I hear you saying that during that period of time when we're all together, that there cannot be even innuendos or people trying to find out what the temperature is? Because in the past, I've experienced a little difference in that happening, and I need clarification on that.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about executive sessions and what you're allowed to do in executive session, because you are allowed to have discussions and deliberations in executive session where people are expressing their opinions. And I will tell you, if everybody expresses their opinions, sometimes it can be pretty clear where everybody stands, what the temperature of the room is. But that's different than asking for a vote on something. And that's where the difference is. And there are some court cases in our state. I'm glad they don't involve school districts. They've all involved cities where city council members went into an executive session and there was a checking of the temperature that got too close to the line, and the court said that was a secret vote and they couldn't have that. They were appointing somebody, I think, to the Parks Commission Board. I think it was a City of Tacoma case at the top of my head as I'm remembering it. And so it's very different if, the president goes around and says, hey, I'd like to hear, Director Clark, what are you thinking about? Let's say the topic was the evaluation of somebody. What are your thoughts on this? You can ask for that and get Director Clark's thoughts. You can ask for Director Bettinger's thoughts. You can ask for Director Bento's thoughts. You can offer your own thoughts. You can gather thoughts from everybody. What you can't do is say, okay, now let's all take a vote. That's where you would cross the line.
And what action, if you were a council person or a director or anybody experiencing that, and you didn't think that was the right thing to do, let's just say it happened, not just hypothetically, what's the action that any council person or director or person on that in that situation takes to correct it?
Yeah, the remedy for this, really individually, is to speak up at the moment, bring it to everyone's attention that you believe that this is a violation, and then not participate in it. And that, obviously, there are, it can get very contentious at that point in time when you're trying to call everybody else on something. It's nice when you can all say, oh, we all understand this. We shouldn't have done that. We all agree, and you stop right there. If there's any dispute about it, your choice as an individual elected official would be to remove yourself from that situation and not continue with a meeting that is in violation.
Thank you.
Okay. So the last piece of operating in the open I wanted to make sure we talk about is also about committees and advisory groups. Because we've had some changes in the legislation. It's been quite a while ago now where they clarified that the Open Meetings Act obviously applies to governing boards, the 5 of you, but it could also apply to any committees of a school district in certain circumstances. And they clarified which ones also have to comply with the Open Meetings Act. And the ones that have to comply are those that are acting on behalf of the board, holding hearings, or taking testimony. And a committee is acting on behalf of the board if there are 3 or more of you on it. So occasionally, it's not very common, but occasionally school districts will create a committee. Let's say it was a committee to discuss boundaries for schools, which kids went to which elementary school. And we wanted a committee to get together and talk about that. If you put 3 board members on that committee, all of a sudden that committee would now have to comply with the Open Public Meetings Act because there's a quorum of the 3 of you talking. And that is why most districts, when they create committees and put board members on it, will only put 2 people, a maximum of 2 on that committee, so that we are not all of a sudden creating a new meeting that has to comply with all of the OPMA parts. Another example would be if you delegated your authority. So if you said, rather than us deciding what the boundaries are going to be for schools, we're just going to let the committee make the decision. And we will go along with whatever that committee says. If you delegate your authority, all of a sudden that committee now must comply with the Open Public Meetings Act as well, which doesn't happen very often. That's why a lot of things come back to the board. Even when you have committees working and you have all sorts of parents and teachers getting together and making decisions, all they really do is make recommendations. And then the recommendation still comes back to you and you make the final decision. And as long as that's what they're doing is making a recommendation, not making the decision, then the OPMA doesn't apply to that committee. The third time when it could be seen as acting on your behalf is if you don't officially give it authority, but you always go along with whatever it says. It's what's called a de facto delegation. So you haven't delegated officially your authority, but you in practice always go along with whatever that committee says. In that case, the law says that would also apply the OPMA to that particular committee. That's a technical area. It doesn't come up all that often to boards, but it is a big piece of just understanding the breadth. When we say the public's business has to be done in the open, it also could apply to some committees. Any questions on that before we move on to the next slide?
Mr. Porter, so do I hear you clearly that if you had a budget committee or something like that, and they had discussions and stuff like that, and they had committee members, the trick of not having an open public meeting would be not to have 3 board members sit on that committee, so it would be forced to be an open public meeting. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, because that has come up.
But you also said that if they de facto take everything the committee suggests, then that also would make them responsible for following Open Public Meeting Act. Is that correct?
Yeah, if it's what's called de facto delegation. If you haven't officially delegated, but in practice, you have delegated your authority, which is one of the reasons we want our boards to be asking questions at their board meetings. We're going to talk later about the fiduciary duty, and one of your fiduciary duties is to make sure that the right decisions are being made. It's to ask questions about things that are brought to your attention. It doesn't mean that you're going to reject committee recommendations just because. Hopefully, if it's a well-run committee, it's bringing a good recommendation to you. But one of the ways we know that you haven't delegated your authority is by having you ask questions and understand how they got to their decision, and then decide that it was the wisest decision, and that's why you will agree to vote for it. Director Bento, you had a question?
I guess for my knowledge, I guess through Paul or through President Hamada, do we have any committees that fall under this provision of de facto?
Since I've been, I haven't seen any formal appointment in public of any committees, but I don't have the institutional knowledge, but the president may have better knowledge.
I will tell you from my experience, it's very rare in school districts that we have any de facto delegations. The area where we worried about it the most is there was a movement in the early 1990s for what we called site-based decision-making. And a lot of boards wanted to delegate their authority to site-based decision-making teams at each school. And that's when we looked very closely at this particular definition to decide, has the board really delegated its authority to the site-based decision-making team, in which case that site team had to comply with the Open Public Meeting Act. That's the last time I really saw a widespread potential violation in this area.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on then to talk about sort of the area that are the exceptions. When can you not do business in the open if you wanted to? And that's most people know of as executive sessions. That's a type of meeting that you have that the public is excluded from. What business can you actually conduct in an executive session? Well, first you should know there's a procedural rule. So even before you talk about what topics are, you have to do it the right way. And there are two pieces to that in particular. You have to announce publicly what the purpose is for excluding the public, which really means telling them, which topic does this fall under that allows us to go into an executive session. We'll talk about those in just a moment, but you have to announce that publicly, and you have to announce the time you're returning, just in case somebody wanted to be there and not miss that next big vote that you do. You have to let them know, and we expect to be back in 30 minutes. Now, that doesn't stop you from extending that time, because you may get into an executive session and the conversation we thought was going to be 30 minutes. Well, we need an extra 15. The proper procedure then is for the president to go back out to the open room and let everybody know we're going to be another 15 minutes, and let them know when you estimate you will be back. And again, it's about letting the public be there for the open public part of the meeting if they wanted to. So that's the procedural thing you have to do. Question from President Hamada.
All right, but I'm really trying to get all this stuff very clear in my head. And we have on our website why our executive meeting or a special meeting there's a kind of a script on it, but are you saying, to be absolutely correct, when we go into an executive session, if it's after our board member, before or in the middle, I should be reading a whole thing other than just saying we're going into executive session? I should explain it to the public why we're going into it and the purpose?
Yeah, it should be announced, the purpose. It doesn't have to be much more than a couple of phrases. We're going into an executive session to discuss the selection or acquisition of real estate.
But I need to do that other than just saying we're going into an executive session. Okay, thank
That's
you.
the appropriate thing to do. I will tell you, I love the practice of it being on the agenda itself, because that creates a record. That's not required by the statute. However, I have seen it help a lot of school districts. The auditor's office actually chose this particular rule, the executive session rule, 1 year as its special investigative area. And they went in and they asked all school districts to prove they had complied with this particular rule. And those districts that had written it down on their agenda had wonderful proof that they let the public know the reason why they went into an executive session. So it's not required by statute, but it has saved a lot of districts who people have questioned whether or not they actually identified to the public. But yes, technically you should be verbally announcing what the purpose is for this executive session. It doesn't have to be much more than a couple of phrases. Usually it's reading something right off the agenda. Okay, so that's the procedural things for us to do this properly. What are the types of topics? I will tell you there's, obviously very specific statutory language that nobody is going to try to memorize, including me. So I have grouped them all into sort of 3 areas. The first is for real estate and public works. I think that's easier for people to remember, that if the topic is about real estate and public works, it's possible we might be able to have an executive session. Now, technically, it is not every conversation about real estate. I've written it in the handout that I've given you there. It's to consider the selection or acquisition of real estate when public knowledge would likely cause an increased price. It's to consider the minimum price at which you're going to offer real estate for sale, or it's to review negotiations on publicly bid contracts when public knowledge about those negotiations would cause an increased cost. So it's a lot narrower and more technical, but nobody's going to memorize all of those phrases. I think it's easier for you to remember, does this fall within the real estate and public works area? If so, then you can go look it up and make sure it fits within one of those phrases. So that's the first area, real estate and public works. And it's being done not because we think it's okay to have secret conversations, but it's because the public wants you to have that in secret to protect their purse, to protect their tax dollars. They don't want you paying more for real estate or selling your own real estate for less than you should. And so that's why they allow secret conversations to be had about that. The second category, also in broad terms for people to understand, for employees and appointments. And again, it's not every discussion about an employee, but that's the easier way to remember. The second broad category that you can have an exec session about is an employee or an appointment. Technically, it's to receive and evaluate complaints or charges brought against an officer or employee. So that's anytime someone is alleging misconduct. They're saying our teacher did something wrong or our board member did something wrong. That would be making an allegation, a charge against a public officer or an employee. You can go into an executive session to talk about that. Now, again, you can't take a vote on it. So you can't decide we're going to fire the teacher in the executive session. You'd have to come back out into the public session and take a vote on it. But you can have a conversation about it in the executive session. The second area of employee appointments is to evaluate qualifications of applicants. So you don't have to review resumes in the public meeting. You can actually, if you're reviewing, why are we hiring this person to be our superintendent? You get to have that conversation in an executive session because you're reviewing the qualifications of a person. That can have that conversation. Again, the vote to actually hire the superintendent would have to be in the open meeting, but the conversation about that person's qualifications could be held in the executive session. It's also reviewing the performance of a public employee. So the one that I know is one of the key responsibilities of a school board is to evaluate the superintendent. And you can have a conversation about the performance of the superintendent in an executive session. That is clearly allowed. Now, we can't take votes there, as we talked about earlier, and I won't try to repeat myself on that. So we're not taking a vote on the evaluation, but you can feel free to have a conversation and you can hear everybody's opinions in that conversation in an executive session if you're dealing with the performance of a public employee, including the superintendent. The third one that's also in this area is about appointments. So if you're evaluating qualifications of a candidate for an appointment, so let's say you have an open seat on the board because somebody resigned and you need to fill that seat, you're allowed to have a discussion about the qualifications of those candidates in an executive session. In that case, it's like hiring somebody, except you're not hiring them because they're not an employee, but they allow you to have a conversation about it. They did carve out an exception to that one, that if you do interviews for appointments, the interview itself has to be in the open session. That's a very specific rule that they wrote. If you're appointing somebody to an elected office, you have to do the interviews in public, but you can have a discussion about their qualifications in an executive session. That's only for appointment to an elective office. If we are talking about hiring somebody, i.e. the superintendent, you technically can do those interviews in an executive session because that interview process is considered part of considering the qualifications of a candidate. The third large area that you're allowed to have executive sessions on are things that are attorney-client privileged. Again, this is another one where there are some technical phrases, so it's not broadly anything that's legal. And I'll tell you, when I started practicing, that's what the common practice was, that the superintendent would just put on the agenda, we're going to exec session for a legal topic. And some school districts, who I won't name, got in trouble for that, because it's not every single legal topic that you can go into an exec session for. Specifically, is to discuss with legal counsel litigation, potential litigation, or legal risks of a proposed action. So the key pieces there has to be a lawyer involved. So the 5 board members can't get together and say, we're just going to talk about a legal topic, the lawsuit that's been brought against the school district, or the lawsuit that we want to file. Attorney-client privilege are communications with an attorney, so there has to be an attorney present. Now, as you all know, as we're doing tonight, presence doesn't necessarily mean physically. You could have the attorney on the phone, you could have them there by Zoom, or they could be there physically, but you need to have an attorney there to fall within this exception. And that person should be talking to you about litigation, potential litigation, or the proposed legal risks of an action. So maybe there isn't a lawsuit, but you want to know, if we adopt this policy, are we going to get sued? That's the kind of conversation that you, to protect the public's budget, you are allowed to have a conversation with an attorney in an executive session about that. You don't have to reveal all of your legal defenses publicly. You're allowed to have the same advantage as any other business or person and have an attorney-client privileged conversation. And so in
Buzz,
your-
can I stop
Yes.
you there for just a second?
Yep.
So at that point, how could you, hoping you can characterize the attorney-client privilege that may or may not have been formed at that juncture for the board, and then what it means to waive that, what procedures should be followed in order for that conversation to be made public at some point?
Yeah, so that second question is pretty easy. It's very clear in the law. No individual board member has the right to waive that privilege. The privilege belongs to the group of you, which means the 5 of you. And that means, as you know, for the 5 of you to make any decision, it takes 3 votes. So for you to waive the privilege, 3 of you would have to agree that you want to waive the privilege, which is the client in any attorney-client relationship has that right to decide, I don't want to keep this private. I actually want to tell everybody what my attorney just told me. If you want to do that, if you want to reveal the legal advice that you've been given, you can decide to do that, but it would take 3 of you who want to do that. 2 of you couldn't decide, we want the public to know what our attorney told us. It would take 3 of you. The first part of that question, Paul, I think you were talking, when do you know there's an attorney-client relationship to begin with? You have to know who is representing you. Every time you have a conversation with an attorney doesn't necessarily mean you have an attorney-client privileged conversation. Tonight, for example, I'm speaking here in the public and anybody could be listening into us. So this is not a private conversation. So we're not having an attorney-client relationship right now with you. I'm obviously providing legal information to you, and I'll do this in an educational context, but I can't give you any private attorney-client advice right now because we're meeting in the public. Unless all of you wanted to have it in the public and wanted the public to know what advice I was giving you. If you wanted specific legal advice on specific set of facts, either litigation or potential litigation or the proposed legal risks of an action, we could go into an executive session and I can give you legal advice at that point in time. And then 3 of you could decide whether you wanted to release that or not, or 3 of you could decide we don't want to, and the others can't do anything about it.
Thanks, Buzz.
Yep. Looks like there's a question, another question from you, Director Hamada.
Yes. Will you be addressing later on, like, we have a board attorney, and when can we put on, if we're having a conversation with the board attorney, or probably, I guess, our district attorney, when does that become an email back and forth? It has to be 3 board members to talk about it, or if I'm talking to a board attorney or I'm talking to our school district attorney, that is always going to be open in an email, open public meetings, so they can get public information on it?
And not necessarily. I think that it's a complicated area you're talking about. It's very rare that boards will have a legal advisor who's different than the school district's legal advisor. In general, and I do this, representing 105 school districts in Washington, our client, I have to know from my ethical duties, is the school board. And in fact, whenever we start representing a school district, we send a letter to that school district. I usually address it to the superintendent, and we have a line in there where we explain to them that our client is the school board. If 99 times out of 100, the school board acts through the superintendent. So the superintendent on a day-to-day is giving me direction as my client. And that's who I'm giving legal advice to, and the superintendent will pass that on to the board if the board is involved in some particular matter. But it's very, very rare. There's only really one time where I would be talking directly to a board and not going through the superintendent in almost every single case. And that's the only case is when there's a dispute between the superintendent and the board. In that particular case, it's like, the employment, and I've negotiated on behalf of boards, the employment contracts with many superintendents. And those cases, I have to be really clear with the superintendent. I don't represent him in that transaction. I represent the board. And so I'm going to pursue the board's interests, and I'll be answering back. Usually the board will speak through the board president. They'll delegate to the president to talk to me, or they'll have me come and talk to the whole board at one time. But it's usually only when there's a dispute between the board president, between the superintendent and the board, that we end up with separate counsel. And then we tell the superintendent he's on his own, she's on her own. They have to get their own counsel at that point in time. It's very, very rare that we think about the district having any legal advisor that's different than the board's legal advisor, because the board is the client from an ethical standpoint. That's who the attorney has to answer to. And as we know, that means 3 of you. In case the 5 of you don't agree, which I will tell you in most cases you do. But if there's a dispute among the board, 3 of you get to direct the attorney, because the 3 of you can decide what the district is going to do. I
But
see.
Any communication back and forth on email, if it's made from a board position, is still open public meeting, they can public records that?
So that's going to be a public records question, not a meeting, because you're
That's
dealing
all.
it. And
Yeah.
so as long as it's a conversation between the attorney and a board member, it's not a meeting, because we don't have other board members involved in
Okay.
it. Or if it were, say, the attorney sending it to all 5 board members, but there's no reply, that could be done as well. But then it's going to be a public record issue. When we get over to the Public Records Act, the next topic we're going to talk about, it will be considered a public record, but it'll be redacted, because we also have an exception for attorney-client privileged information, and we'll redact anything that's attorney-client privileged before we release it to the public.
Okay.
So a similar rule will come up basically under the Public Records Act. I see, and I want to make sure I get to Director Farah. It looks like you have a question.
Yes, I do. And I just want to go back a little bit and ask you a question that came to mind, but I didn't have the chance to ask before we moved on.
Sure.
Can like special meetings have multiple agenda instead of one agenda?
So it'll be one agenda, be multiple topics on one agenda. Yes.
Right.
You could have a special meeting that has 10 different topics if you wanted to, or it could be just one. And I will tell you, I don't know that there's a pattern there. Most of the time, you all are so busy, it's hard for us to get 5 of you together, that we try to concentrate all of our work. And so we try not to have too many special meetings with just one topic. We usually will try to, let's gather up 3 or 4. If we're going to have a special meeting, let's go ahead and have 3 or 4 topics. That's more common in my experience.
And the same with the executive session, correct?
Correct. An executive session, you can have a special meeting that is nothing but an executive session, because the only topic qualifies. Or you could have an executive session that has 3 different topics that could fall. You could have a real estate conversation. Maybe you're looking at qualifications of candidates for employment, and you're having a discussion with your attorney. You could do all of that in the same meeting. You would just identify those as 3 separate topics, reasons why you're allowed to go into an exec session.
Thank you.
Okay. We've made it down to the bottom of the slide on executive sessions, but believe it or not, we're not done talking about the exceptions to when you can do your business in the public, because there's a whole nother category they created in the law of topics that are completely exempt from the act. So these aren't things that you can go into executive session on. They said this topic is exempt from the Open Public Meetings Act. In practice, most districts will treat this like an executive session, because it's another topic. And we have all 5 of you together, so we might as well do it when we're doing executive sessions. But technically under the act, it's not considered an executive session, it's considered an exempt topic. So the first one is quasi-judicial matters. The most common one that I used to have school districts doing, and we have a lot fewer of these days because of changes in the law, but many school boards used to be doing a lot of student discipline appeals. So when a student was being expelled from school, they'd have a right to have a hearing with an independent hearing officer, and then they got appealed to the school board. And every time we had one of those hearings in front of the school board, it was considered an exempt meeting. We didn't have to publicize it as a meeting, as a regular or special meeting, because it was considered quasi-judicial. You were acting as a judge. We don't have very many of these in anymore. We're not expelling kids much anymore, so we don't have very many of these appeals that come out, and there aren't many other topics that are quasi-judicial. There's one in the city area when the cities are doing certain land use petitions. They're considered to be in a quasi-judicial capacity, and they're making those kinds of things. So they have sometimes some quasi-judicial hearings as a city council or a land use planning board would have, but we don't have very many of those in school districts. It doesn't come up all that often. Director Bettinger.
We have a policy 4220 that if a citizen complains about something, they can go all the way up the chain of command to the school board to have a hearing. So would that fall under this quasi-judicial?
Yes. If you're doing any kind of an appeal hearing, there's also some board policies usually that you've adopted around discrimination complaints that can also make their way to the board level. That would be another one where you could be having a hearing that would be considered quasi-judicial. Okay. The next big category that's considered exempt are collective bargaining sessions or discussions about collective bargaining and professional negotiations. So if you need to get together to decide whether or not you're going to accept that last offer that was made by one of your labor unions, technically that is a discussion about collective bargaining and it's an exempt topic. So you don't have to do it at a special meeting or a regular meeting. I will tell you most districts will try to structure them because it's so hard to get all of you together and do it as a part of an executive session with other topics that are executive session topics. But technically, I've been in some labor disputes that are going into the late wee hours of the night, and we need to know what does our board think about this. Technically, we don't have to give that 24-hour notice. We can get the board together on short notice and take your temperature really quickly on what you think about a particular topic if we're trying to settle a contract at midnight and have everybody back into school the next day. Because this particular exception allows us to do that. Most often, we just try to structure this as part of one of the executive sessions because that's when it's more convenient to do it. It's clear, however, that even if it's exempt from the Open Public Meetings Act, we're still not taking secret ballots. So that rule still applies even if the topic is exempt, and that's important for you to recognize. Okay, the other exception I want to mention, it's actually not listed in the statute, but we have an Attorney General opinion. Someone went to the Attorney General and said, do we violate the Open Meetings Act if 3 of our board members all show up at the same birthday party? Or if all 5 board members go to the WASDA annual conference at the same time? Are we violating the Open Public Meetings Act? And the Attorney General gave us an opinion, which we can rely upon as the Attorney General's opinion. So it's not the same as a court opinion, but it's still considered persuasive legal advice, that if you are merely having a social event or merely attending a conference, you're not having a meeting at which you are discussing or deliberating school district business. What that means is if you do all go to the WASDA conference, we often will give you a reminder to not gather together and start talking about how you want to apply all the things you're learning back to your own school district. If you want to have that kind of a conversation, you need to schedule it as a special meeting. And I have some districts who do. They schedule a special meeting at the WASDA conference as an opportunity for them to get together and talk about their district's business while they're all there at the hotel together. And other people can come and watch if they want to. Question from Director Clark.
Yes, if I can. So what about staff and directors taking a break between meetings to have pizza? Or as long as we're not getting into matters of affairs, I assume that's all right.
Yep, just don't discuss or deliberate over district business. You can all have dinner together. But you need to be talking about personal matters and not school district business. If you want to talk about school district business, we call it a special or a regular meeting. And I have some districts who do that. They get their boards together and they have dinner together, but they note it and actually advertise it as a special meeting. And if we want to exclude the public, it has to be one of these topics that's either excluded from the Open Public Meetings Act or an executive session.
Thank you.
Okay. What are the consequences? Why do we care? Bottom line, is there any enforcement of the Open Public Meetings Act? How does it get enforced? The one that people forget about that is actually, I think, most important and most damaging is that any action that you take at a meeting that's in violation is void. That creates all sorts of legal problems for the school district as an entity. And again, later tonight, we're going to talk about your fiduciary duty and to protect the interests of the school district. And this could be one where you'd be creating huge legal problems for the school district if you take actions that are void, because all of a sudden now we could be creating liability to the district because they entered into a contract with somebody that you voted on at an illegal meeting, and we may now owe money to that particular entity, or certain individuals who acted on that might owe money. So it's just remember that any actions that you take in an illegal meeting are void, and that could have serious consequences. People forget about that one. The one that they remember, personal liability. In our law, they wrote in some very specific penalties. It's $500 for a first violation and $1,000 for a second violation of the act. That's the one board members usually remember. An even more expensive one to the school district. This is one that the school district would be paying. It wouldn't be coming from the board members' pockets. And that's that anyone can sue to enforce the OPMA. Just anybody who doesn't like you can sue you if you violated the act, and we have to pay their attorney's fees and costs. And if anybody has been involved in legal action, you know that gets really expensive really quick. That $1,000 fine for your second violation will be nothing compared to the $60,000 or $70,000 bill you will be getting from the attorney for the person who sued you over it. So that's really the biggest cost item for people to worry about, are the costs and attorney's fees from losing one of these lawsuits. The fourth way that it's enforced is through a recall petition. Washington State actually has a very narrow recall petition, unlike, say, California, where you just need people to sign a petition that they want to recall you from office, and there will be a vote on it if you have enough people who sign the petition. That doesn't work in Washington. In Washington State, you can only recall an elected official if they have engaged in malfeasance or misfeasance or violation of their oath of office. But our courts have said that violating the OPMA would be considered a violation of your oath of office or malfeasance. So this is an area that can be enforced through a recall petition. If somebody just disagrees with you, a decision that you've made, they can't recall you. You violate the Open Public Meetings Act, they could recall you. Any questions about consequences before we move on? We've had a lot of good in-depth discussion about the OPMA. So I'm going to try to jump. Our next topic we're going to talk about is Public Records Act. People get them confused all the time, but they are, hopefully you'll be walking away understanding, very different. The OPMA is about meetings. It's about when 3 or more of you are discussing or deliberating over district business. Public records are something that's not about a meeting. First question to ask, what is a public record? It's anything related to the function or performance of government, anything that's recorded. So it's not just pieces of paper. It is also all of the data that is electronic. It is also any tape recordings, any video recordings, all of the camera footage that is taken by a school district. All of that is something that is recorded. If it is something that is recorded, something that's either written down or taken down by some machine, it's now a record. Once it's a record, it is considered a public record, as long as it's related to the function or performance of government. There was actually a case, I don't know if it was a school district case, I think it was a city case. I think it was City of Spokane, the late 1990s, where there were emails being sent by a particular school district employee. And the court had to look at, were those emails considered a public record? And the court said, yes, email itself, yes, email is a record, so it could be a public record. However, it depends on the content of that email. In that particular case, the emails were not about the function or performance of government. It was not about that person's job. What we did is we had an employee who was spending their public time, I think they were involved in some knitting club, and they were sending out emails to all of the members of the knitting club and wasting a lot of time doing that. In that particular case, the court said the email would be a record, but it's not a public record because the subject of it was not about city business. So it's a record that's about the business of government. That's when it becomes a public record. It doesn't depend on the physical form of the record. It doesn't depend on who owns the device. And that's another area we've had a lot of litigation in the last 10 years. Because we've had a lot of people who are doing things by cell phone, by email, on personal computers. The question came up, if you as a board member are sending a text message on your personal phone, does that become a public record? And the courts have made it pretty clear to us now that yes, it is, if the content of that record is about public business. So if you have a constituent, one of the people who voted for you who wants to ask you a question, and they send you a text message on your personal cell phone, that particular record all of a sudden might have to get released as a public record. If somebody makes a request for it, we're going to have to go to you and say, hey, do you have any text messages on your personal cell phone that are about public business? Because we need a copy of it to give to somebody who's made a request for that. And we actually had some elected officials who had to give up their personal devices for us to do a search on their device for any records that were responsive to the request that had been made. And that, as you can tell, would be very disruptive to your personal life, for you have to give up your personal cell phone or your personal computer. So almost all public entities have moved in the last 10 years to making sure all of their elected officials have an official government issued computer and or cell phone, something that they can do their public business on that is separate from their personal device. So that if we do get a public records request, we don't have to take your personal device. We just do a search of the government device. And that's really easy for email because we back up all of your district email gets backed up somewhere. So we don't have to interrupt your life to go check for, do you have any emails on this topic when somebody makes a public records request for it? And that's the reason most districts have moved that direction of providing a government-owned device for all the public business to be done, because it's easier for us to respond to public records requests. I see Director Bento, you have a follow-up question.
Yeah, I guess my question, what does that include social media? So if someone messages me on my Instagram, my personal Instagram page, asking me about something, and I direct them, actually email my district account, please. Like, could that technically be considered a public record, like any social media?
Yes.
Thank you.
It's one of the reasons we honestly advise that you not use personal social media accounts to do public business. You can, if you want to. It's not illegal to do it. It just means it's now going to be subject to a public record search.
Okay, I have a follow-up question then. So when I ran for office, I had a campaign social media that people sometimes ask questions through there too. Would that qualify as well, or not be included?
Not if it's part of your campaign, because actually you can't use public resources to support your campaign. So anything that's campaign related has to be done with personal resources.
Correct, but someone might say something like, oh, hey, I have a question about boundaries, blah, blah, blah. So I can just direct them, please email my personal account. This is or my school account. This is my campaign account.
Yep, that's what you do. And a lot of people, because you get contacted all of the time, people who are very well-meaning, they just don't understand the difference. So the practice you're talking about of forwarding things is very important. I think it's a nice tool to have a way to, anytime that somebody contacts you outside of the officially recorded and backed up media, that you find a way to forward stuff to it so that what somebody asked you a question on does get backed up. And once we know that all of those personal things have been forwarded to your district account, then you don't have to worry about having to give up your personal device if we get a request for it.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Okay. So we've talked about it's any record that relates to the function or performance of government, regardless of the physical form, regardless of who owns the device. I wanted to mention an area we've had a lot of litigation on in the last 10 or 15 years, and that's something called metadata as well. People don't know about this because they don't think about it, but every time we're doing something electronically, what you may see in front of you on the screen, or even that what's printed out on the piece of paper, it's only one part of all of the data that is created with that record. So every time you create a document, let's say in Microsoft Word, there's a lot of other data that's hiding in the background. Microsoft Word, not necessarily Microsoft, they're not keeping copies of it, but your computer is creating copies of all sorts of data, such as all of the changes that you made, all of the words that you deleted, so that you can go back and do the undo button. It collects all of that data. You don't actually see that when you see it on the screen, but it's data that is hiding in the background, and the courts have said that also counts as part of the record. And so some, I'll call them smart people who have made public records requests who want to discover something, have made life difficult for us in the public by making a request, not just for the record itself, but all of the metadata that is associated with that record. And that can get into a lot of extra things. So it's not as easy as me just going through and making photocopies of all of the letters. If it was an electronic record and there's metadata that is connected to it, I also have to find a way to provide that metadata to somebody who makes that request as well. which is one of the many ways in which this particular act has gotten very difficult and expensive to comply with, because we have to produce all of that. What are your duties with regard to all of these records? We have a duty to disclose it. That's what we've been talking about. If somebody asks for it, they have a right to see it. There's also a duty to redact. There are certain things that we do not have to provide and certain things we can't provide. So for example, one of the biggest ones for school districts is student information. We have a federal statute that says that student information, anything that's retained in a student record, cannot be released to anyone without the family's permission. And so when we get a request for records that happen to be student records, we have to go through and darken out every place where a student's name is in that record, because we're not allowed to identify the student in that record. So it's a duty to redact that we have. That's another area that people didn't realize that why this law is so expensive to try to comply with, because it takes a lot of time by some staff member to go through every record and figure out what can we release, what can we not release, and make sure that we're not violating any of those statutes. So we have a duty to disclose. We also have a duty to redact. We then had court cases within the last 15 years that said, not only do you have to redact it, you have to tell people why you were allowed to redact it, which means when we release something with redactions, we also have to give them what's called a redaction log. We have to go through and identify what was the statute that allowed us to take this information out, which exception are we relying upon? And so we provide a redaction log that goes along with it. That's also an expensive, time-consuming thing that we have to do. We also have a duty to respond promptly. Now, people misunderstand this one. They think that it's what we call the 5-day rule. There is a 5-day rule that is written into the statute. It says we have to reply within 5 days, but it doesn't say you provide the record within 5 days. What it says is we have to acknowledge that we've received the request and give them an estimate of how long it will take us to respond to their request. So if they ask us, for example, I want copies of any document related to your budget for the last 10 years. It might take us more than 5 days to gather that information together. So what we need to do is within 5 days say, hey, we received your request. This is what we think you're asking for. We think it's going to take us about 25 days to do this, and we'll give you an update if that changes. And that's what we have to provide within the 5 days. Who pays for this? I'll tell you, it's not the public. There are no fees for searching or inspecting records. So if people just want to see a copy of it, they just want to come in and look at it, and they don't want to take the copy with them, we can't actually charge them for looking at a document. If they said, all I want to do is come in and look at all the documents related to the budget, I don't want you to make copies of them and that I can take home with me. I just want to look at it. I can't charge them for coming in and looking at a document. I can't charge them for the hours and hours of time it took a staff member to go find all of those documents. All of that is something that the courts have said that the law requires the public entity to pay for itself. Any of the time involved in searching or just providing the record for inspection. Now, if somebody wants copies of that record, we can charge for the copy, but there are really specific limits. And pretty much it's known as the 15-cent per page rule. That's the maximum you can charge. Technically, you can charge more if you have a way of justifying that the actual cost of the record, making a copy cost you more, but very few people do go through that process. So most just use the maximum per page rule if they're making photocopies of something. We had a number of districts who got requests for 100,000 pages, went through all the trouble of doing it, and the person never came and picked it up and paid the bill because they didn't want to pay for the 15 cents per page. So what they've created in the law is this ability to require somebody to give us a deposit. If you want us to make 100,000 copies of something, and we know that's going to cost us a lot of money, you have to give us a deposit first before we're going to go through all the trouble of making those records. So that's a new technique that we have for trying to not waste time and money. Another way is to do it by installments. So I can say, if you come today, I'll have the first 10,000 pages for you. And if they never come and pick up the first 10,000 pages, you don't have to continue making copies of the second 10,000 pages. So it's another tool that we have to make sure that people are really serious about paying for the cost of the copies is by providing things in installments. And it also helps us actually get things out quicker because getting 100,000 pages of something may take us 6 months, but I can get the first 10,000 pages to you in a month. So rather than making somebody wait the full 6 months, we can tell them, I'll have the first 10,000 pages for you available next month. And then if they don't come pick that up, I can consider the request closed. I don't have to continue working on it. What are the consequences if we violate this particular act? There are daily fines of $100. What I didn't put on the slide here, but I think it's in your handout, it's $100 per record. So if you have somebody who has asked for 50 records at $100 a day, all of a sudden we're talking about a $5,000 per day fine that you could be getting. And there are entities who have had fines in the hundreds of thousands of dollars because of their violation of this act. In fact, there's one particular individual, there may be more, but one who is very well known around the state, who is making a living at doing nothing but making public records requests, trying to catch public entities making mistakes, and then getting money, getting a fine. I think in our law firm have at least 3 or 4 cases going at all times where he is suing a school district for what he thinks is violations of this act. And he lives up in, I think it's Island County is where he lives. He doesn't even live in most of the places where he puts public records requests. He just sends a request because he thinks he can catch somebody at violating this act. And there are other lawyers who know about this. Very few of them are trying to make a living at it. We only know of this one individual who's been doing this now for almost a dozen years. As with the Open Public Meetings Act, one of the more expensive pieces of this is if somebody could get their attorney's fees paid for. So there are some attorneys who will bring lawsuits just because they know they could get their bills paid, basically, if they win this case. Okay. We've done the OPMA, we've done the PRA. The next ones won't take quite as long. Those are the 2 biggest ones, but we do have other ones we want to talk about as well. I'm just going to take a deep breath here and ask, are there any questions about those 2 big ones before we move on? Director Bettinger.
So being honest here, just being transparent, sometimes, how does a board director get public records? Because I'll be honest, there are times where citizens have shared public records with me and it's like, wow, I didn't know that. And had I known that, it might have impacted a decision or I would have maybe acted in a different way. So, I mean, what's the responsibility of the district for giving board directors information?
Yeah, I think I've got 2 different answers to that question. One, talking first about the Public Records Act. Technically, a board member is a member of the public where you could make public records requests. If you wanted to, you're allowed to do that. I don't know many board members who do, but you could. You have the same rights as anybody else to ask for records. I would say more often the answer you're talking about is more about board procedures and your relationships with the administration and providing you the information that you need on the topics that you need to make decisions. Oftentimes that's part of your working agreements that you will either make with each other. And I think that we're going to talk about one of your board policies near the end of today, where you have made agreements with each other about how you're going to act. You also in Kent have an agreement with your superintendent, and this for a number of years. I noticed the Kent board has had a working agreement with the superintendent of how you're going to do business. And that would be the type of topic that would be addressed in there. How do board members get the information that they think they need to make wise decisions about things? And that's just one of the things you'd want to talk about is can each individual board member ask for it? Or, because oftentimes what happens, I was working with another board earlier this week. It's really important to them. They were explaining to me that they want all board members to have the same information. They don't want one board member to have more information than somebody else. So one of their working agreements is if there is a document that is provided to one board member, the superintendent will then provide a copy of the same record to the other 4, because they want all 5 to be working on the same basis. Now, one individual board member doesn't have the right necessarily to every record of the district as a board member. So I have had that dispute occasionally come out, very, very rare, but occasionally one board member wants something that the other board members say there's no need for that one board member to go be rifling through the files of, let's say, a particular student, because it would actually violate the FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, for a board member to be looking at records that they don't need to look at because they're not dealing with that particular student. And one board member, just because they're a board member, doesn't have a right to those records. Now, 3 board members could order the superintendent to provide a record. So if there's any dispute between a superintendent and the board about looking at a record, the answer legally would come down to, do 3 of you want it? 3 of you could take a vote and say, give us the record. But again, it should be making sure, I would want to advise you, if I were your attorney at that time, that you're making sure it's a record that you do have a need for, and you're not doing things like looking at confidential student records, because we have a lot of them, and there could be other confidential records as well. I'd want to make sure you knew that if you did that, you might be creating liability for the district. Okay.
I have just a little bit of follow-up too, because it's like, because I've never thought I've ever wanted a student record, but it's like, you know, when we talk about creating liability for a district, and maybe it's a bigger topic with my colleagues, but it's like, we are responsible for being first responders or reporters, you know, especially if something might be something that we should be reporting to the state regarding sexual abuse, discrimination, things like that. So, you know, it's a fine line, I think, you know, because.
Well, there are. I mean, when I say that, just because it's a student matter, there are many student matters that you do need to know about to do your jobs. You could be involved in litigation with a particular family, and for you to know, to make the right decision, you would need to know. So there are some times that, yes, for you to have access to things that were normally confidential would be a normal part of your job. It's just not every student record out there. Okay, we've talked about the Open Meetings Act. We've talked about the Public Records Act. I will tell you those are the 2 most important today, because there's actually a law that says you have to do a refresher on them at least once every 4 years. So just so you know, you've now complied with the law that at least once every 4 years, you have received your official training on the Open Public Meetings Act and the Public Records Act. The third one that you also have to have training on is the Records Retention Act. And I'll jump into that after I see we have one more question from Director Bettinger.
I'm applauding that we've finished, because I think we take this every year, but I think it's very important to take it every year, personally.
Great. So the next one we're talking about is records retention. What records does a district have to retain? So the definition is it's anything that's made or received, which means when people send things to the district, sometimes they don't realize that they're sending a record, like they want the board member to see a letter, I'm complaining about something. Once they send it to the school district and it's about school district business, all of a sudden it's something we have to retain. I can't tell the superintendent to go destroy it. It would be illegal. Now it's about public business. We have to retain that record. So if it's made or received by the school district and it's in connection with the transaction of public business. So if it's not about public business, if it is somebody sending a flyer selling automobiles and it just happens to show up in the mailbox for the superintendent, but it's not about us buying any buses or buying any vehicles. It's not about public business. We can toss that. We don't have to retain those, because it was just, you know, an advertisement. Let's say QFC happens to also send all of its coupons to the school district, but we're not shopping at QFC as a school district. We wouldn't have to keep that because it's not about public business. But if somebody is sending you a letter, or if we're sending and creating a record about public business, we have to retain that. That also is regardless of form or characteristics, which means it doesn't depend on whether it's paper or whether it's email or whether it's a tape recording or it's a video recording. It's a record. If it's a record, we have to retain it. That's the broad rule. It's a very broad definition. How do you retain it? This is where it gets very, very technical, and we choose not to go into a lot of detail because we're talking about a book that is about an inch thick. Public records have to be kept, managed, and disposed of according to a records retention schedule. This has changed over my career. We used to have a specific one that was just for school districts, and instead our state archivist has gone to what they call a core schedule, which now applies to multiple public entities. It's a thick book, about an inch thick, and every page has a long list of different types of records. So if you want to know how long do we have to keep it, do we keep it electronically? Do we keep it in paper? Do we send it off to the state archive when we're done? All of those things are in that book. It will tell you how long you have to keep every different type of record. So you look through, there's an index, and you go through and you find out, okay, what's the content of this record? And you find out, an example would be an evaluation of a custodian, a performance evaluation. How long do we have to keep performance evaluations of our custodians? You would search through that book for performance evaluations of employees. And on page 67, you would find, it would tell you that must be kept for a minimum X number of years. And you have to keep the primary copy, or if you have an extra copy of it, you only have to keep the extra copy for 30 days. And that book goes on trying to identify every type of record. Because not every public entity is the same, in addition to the core schedule, we also have something called the school district and ESD schedule. So there's a separate book, another inch thick on top of that, that we have to go through to find out how long we keep things. Most of the time, the length of time you have to keep something is based on how long somebody could sue you based on that record. So if the statute of limitations for suing you is 6 years on a contract, that schedule is going to tell you you better keep all contracts for at least 6 years. If the statute of limitations for suing you for discrimination was 3 years, they would tell you any record related to discrimination, you better keep for at least 3 years. That's where most of those time periods come from. There's a state committee who makes all of those decisions and writes them up in that book. And they're signed off by our Secretary of State who maintains that book, and that's what we have to follow. It's a very technical area. It's why large school districts like Kent have people who are record specialists who make sure that we don't lose records and that we keep copies of things everywhere. If they're paper records, the general rule is we retain them in paper form. If they're electronic records, we maintain them in electronic form. That was a challenge when we first started doing email. That wasn't a natural thing for us to doing email backups. It is now a required thing that all school districts know that if we have electronic records, we have to keep them electronically. And so all large districts have created backup systems to make sure that we retain every email that comes through our system gets kept for a minimum period of time to make sure we don't violate any of these rules. Are there consequences for violating this one too? There are. I will tell you the primary way that people get money out of us for violating this rule is actually by suing us under the Public Records Act, because they find out we didn't keep a record. So until they request a public record, they didn't know that we, by mistake, got rid of one. So that's usually where I see lawsuits about the records. It's not because people are suing us for having destroyed records. It's usually they're suing us because we didn't produce a record on a public records request. And that's where they find out that we violated the Records Retention Act. There are other places. Audit findings used to be the #1 way. The state auditor would come in and when they do your annual audits, and they would choose this as one of their special areas to look at and find out, are you keeping records for the right period of time? Technically in the law, there's a criminal charge for destroying public records illegally. This is another area you could be recalled. If you destroy public records and you knew that you were not supposed to and you did anyway, you could be recalled. That's malfeasance or misfeasance. The most interesting one is this new 5th bullet I've added on the screen, and it's just a case out of December of this year. A local school district, I won't embarrass them here by mentioning their name, but they're north of you. A district north of Kent got sued for not retaining records as part of a lawsuit. There was a family that was suing the school district, and the court entered default judgment for the family because the school district did not retain the records that had been requested by that family. So in other words, the district didn't even get to put on a defense. They said simply because the district didn't provide the records, you automatically lose your lawsuit. In that particular case, I think there was a lawsuit for discrimination or abuse of a child. And so they were looking for some very big dollars. And there's a district north of you who lost that case. It was a Court of Appeals decision that came out in December this year. That is a new, really, really bad consequence of not retaining records. In that particular case, the record they were looking for was security camera footage. The family wanted to see the security camera footage from where their student was being injured on something. And they were suing the school district for not having, taken care of their child who was injured at school. And the district knew that it was supposed to retain records of that security camera, all that footage of what happened in the hallway or out on the playground, and didn't. And they said, and the court said, because you knew you were supposed to retain this, in fact, their lawyer had sent them a particular letter telling them to retain this footage, and they didn't. They destroyed it. They automatically lost their case. So there are serious consequences for not retaining records. That's the bottom line. Any questions about this one? We've gone through this one a lot faster. I don't see anybody jumping in with questions, so I'm going to keep moving us along to make sure we can finish on time tonight. The next topic we want to talk about is a little bit of a shift. We're going away from the open government area, but we're still talking about being ethical in government. Here we're talking about conflicts of interest. It's one of the #1 ethical duties we get questions about all the time. What are conflicts of interest? Technically, it's not every time that you are disloyal to your district. Under this statute, our conflicts of interest statute in Washington, it's when you have what's called a beneficial interest in a contract. And when you see the word beneficial interest, basically you can put a $ next to it. This law was written about people making money off of their job as a board member. So if there is a conflict, a financial conflict in a contract coming up before the school board, such as, let's look at a really bad case. A bad example would be, let's say that you own a textbook company and the district you want the district to buy your textbooks, and you're going to make a really good profit if the district buys your textbooks. That would be a conflict of interest for the district to buy textbooks from you because you are the board member. You would be making a large profit off of that particular sale. That would be a beneficial interest, and we could not enter into a contract with you to buy textbooks from you. That would be just a plain illegal contract. It would be void actually as a contract because there was a conflict. Because you're a board member, it was a contract being made by your vote or under your supervision. So we cannot enter into contracts in which you are beneficially interested. The ones that come up more often usually are around employment. In Washington state, we are a community property state, so that where we applied that most often was actually to spouses. We had a lot of people who had spouses who were employees of school districts, but you as a board member cannot vote on something that beneficially interests your spouse because you also benefited from that in a community property state. So until the late 1990s, it was strictly prohibited for any board member to have any member of their family also be an employee of the school district, none of your spouses or any of your children who are your dependents. Now, once your child is no longer financially dependent upon you, it was different. But any of the children who lived in your household or your spouses could not be employed by the school district. There was an exception that was passed that I'll talk about in a minute in the late 1990s, a narrow exception to that particular rule. But when you think of conflicts of interest, that's the #1 thing I want you to take away from tonight. What we're talking about are financial interests in a matter that's coming before the school district. If you could benefit from it, the school district should not be entering into that transaction. They are prohibited unless an exception exists. But even if an exception, and we're going to talk, we'll have a whole nother slide on what the exceptions are. But even if an exception exists, the board member who has that interest cannot vote on it, and you can't influence anybody else's vote. If you ask us, our advice, it's not required by law, but our advice is to actually not be in the room when they take a vote on this. We were worried actually originally in the way this was written that people were going to start communicating, trying to influence the vote by raising your eyebrows, letting everybody know which way you wanted them to vote. And just to protect you as a board member, we actually advise them that when you are voting on something when the board is voting on something that you have a conflict in, it'd be best for you not to even be in the room. Now, I can't tell you that the law strictly requires that. And I've had some clients who have decided they want to allow that person still to sit in and listen to the conversation, but they have to be really careful that they're not influencing the conversation one way or the other. They can't influence the vote, even if an exception exists to the conflict. When we talk about the exceptions, what are we talking about? There are some small contracts that are allowed. I will tell you that we hardly ever have to do this in large school districts, but you start going into small communities and it's really hard to do business because there are so few people in that city unless you do business with somebody who also happens to be a board member. So for example, if you are a board member who is the only person who can pour concrete in that particular city, and the school district needs a concrete slab poured, and you're the only person for 500 miles, in some cases, there are some small contracts that will be allowed. as an exception. The district can enter into that contract. The limit currently is $1,500 per month is the maximum of the contract amount. So they're very small contracts that can be entered into. And if that example did apply, that board member still could not vote on it themselves and should not influence anybody else in entering into that contract. Another exception, I mentioned just a moment ago, spouse employment. They passed an exception in the late 1990s that if your spouse was employed before you were elected to the board, and if their compensation is the same as anybody else in that position and is governed by a collective bargaining agreement or a board policy that applies to everybody, they can continue to stay employed. They don't have to get fired. Prior to that, that's what happened. Once you got elected, your spouses or anybody else who was a dependent in your household could no longer be employed by the school district. But since they passed that particular exception in the late 1990s, if they were employed prior to being elected, they can stay in their position. There also is an exception that doesn't apply to you because you're a first-class school district. If you weren't aware of that, we have a legal distinction in Washington. We have first-class and second-class districts. And the rule is if you have 2,000 or more students, you are considered first class. If you are less than 2,000, you're considered second class. And we have actually the majority of our districts in Washington are less than 2,000 students. And for second class school districts, they allowed a couple of more exceptions. There is for second class school districts an exception for school bus drivers and for substitute teachers. So I can't actually hire any of your spouses because you're a first class district to be a substitute teacher. But in the small districts, like I have one down in Pierce County where they're a second class district, and I could hire the spouse of one of the board members to be a substitute teacher. So it's an exception that's written into the law. A moment ago, I thought I saw somebody with a question. Let me just double
You
check.
just answered my question because I was going to say we have a sub shortage and I can be like, hey, my partner should just go be a sub, but according to you, we can't. So that was going to be my question.
Yep. Now, you can have volunteers. We can have volunteers who are your spouses or you or your dependents, but no, we can't employ you or your spouse or any of your dependents in your household. And that's actually the sub shortage is why that exception got written. It just only got written for small school districts. They didn't expand it to the large ones. They didn't think you would have quite as bad a problem, but they hadn't met COVID yet. So they had to rewrite it. I would encourage them to make a broader exception. The third type or the fourth kind of exception are called remote interests. There are certain conflicts of interest that they will continue to allow because they think the duty of loyalty is so far removed. And so there's a whole separate section, a subsection of the conflicts of interest statute that are called remote interests. And that list, I wrote it down for you. I didn't put it on the slide here, but I wrote it in your handout. Just very quickly, non-salaried officers of a nonprofit corporation. It's a lot of big words. An example would be, because I have this, a lot of board members are very involved as community members. They will also serve as a board member on other community organizations. So I'm a school board member, but I'll also be a board member, say, of the local Boys and Girls Club, or I'm a board member at the Rotary Club. Technically then, once you're a board member in both, it would be a conflict for the school district to enter into a contract with that organization. And yet a lot of those community groups do business with school districts. So they wrote this exception so that will allow somebody to be a non-salaried officer of a nonprofit corporation. And it's an exception. The district can still do business with that nonprofit corporation. But like we were talking about before, that individual board member still cannot vote on it and can't influence anybody else's vote. So let's say that you were a board member of a local youth sports league who wanted to enter into a contract to rent a baseball field from the school district. And you are on the board of the local Little League. Technically, if there wasn't an exception, the school district couldn't rent its property to that nonprofit, that Little League group. But because of this, as long as you are a non-salaried officer of that in other words, you're not getting paid to do this work, you're just a volunteer board member of the Little League, we can still enter into a contract with the Little League to rent our ball fields. You just can't vote on it yourself. So that's the most common one. The other ones that are listed there, landlord or tenant of a contracting party. So for example, we can do business with somebody who is your tenant. So maybe you have some real estate and you rent apartments somewhere, even though technically you would be benefiting because the contract between the school district and that tenant is giving revenue to the tenant. They're making money off of it so that they can pay you the rent that they owe you. But they said that that relationship is so attenuated, it's called a remote interest. You can't vote on that contract with your tenant, but the school district can still enter into that contract. Another one is where an employer agent is an employee of a group that we're doing business with, but their salary that they're getting is not based on any kind of the number of books they sell. They're just getting a salary. So I've had that before where somebody works for a textbook company, but they just get salary, they get wages for their job. They don't necessarily get extra money if the school district purchases those particular textbooks. So in that case, it was considered a remote interest. The district could still buy those textbooks. That particular board member just couldn't vote on it themselves. Question from Director Hamada.
Yes, I serve presently on the Equity, Social Justice, and Cultural Commission of Covington, the city of Covington. I was appointed by the council. I've been on that committee for about 2 years. There is probably coming up in time a contract that the city of Covington through King County and SROs are involved. And I am non-paid for my commission work I do. It's volunteer. So are you saying that I can participate in the discussion and I need to remove myself during the vote on anything like that when it's going through 3 different parties?
So I would say, first, let's take the easy part of it, that if this were a party that was doing business with the school district, there was a contract between the commission that you are a board member on and the school district. If there was a direct contract relationship, you could neither vote nor could you influence the vote. You can't be involved in the discussion either. So let's say the school district wanted to enter into a contract with your commission to come in and do some training for us. We wanted your commission to train all of our employees on X, Y, or Z topic. We could not enter into that contract with you voting on it or influencing the decision. Now, I think what you're talking about is a commission which is a subsidiary of the city of Covington, and actually the contract would be between the city of Covington and the Kent School District. But you are not on the governing board of the city of Kent. You're just on a commission they've appointed you to. So actually the contract that I see there is probably not between what you are a board member of and the school district. It's between the city of Kent or city of Covington and the Kent School District. And so that is a third party relationship. So you're fully allowed to be involved in that discussion and vote in that particular case.
Thank you.
Question follow-up from Director Benninger.
Okay, I spent many years delivering code of conduct training and conflict of interest training and Sarbanes-Oxley testing and all this. So this is my nerd zone here where I have lots of questions. So we actually have a conflict of interest policy for board and superintendent 1610 that I've asked about this before. It requires us to maintain a log of any contracts or anything subject to policy that we annually should be maintaining. When a new director assumes office, like when I worked for a corporation, every year you had to, disclose where your spouse worked, and so that any potential, and it was just on record, and then you would recuse, a VP would recuse themselves if we were having a contract with someone where his wife worked. So I've brought this up before in this district. This has never happened. I'm entering my 3rd year on the board. We have never at any time, taken the time to discuss where we might, what commissions or other nonprofits we might sit on, where they might eventually come up as a conflict.
So my comment on that will be, I'm aware of the practice you're talking about from my own service on nonprofit boards, where we annually go through and disclose where there could be conflicts. That's where there are known conflicts. The reason that is not a common practice in public entities, at least in Washington state, to do those where they are identified in advance, is they're done at the time the business comes before the governing board. That's where it should be done. And yes, there should be a log, as you talked about, in the board. What's in that board policy is actually just parroting exactly what's in the law. I don't think it added anything to what's actually in the statute. The statute requires that if we are entering into one of those contracts that does create a conflict, at the time that business comes before the board, we have to identify it. We have to put it in the minutes of the meeting that we've identified that, and we have to keep a list of those contracts that somebody could come inspect anytime they wanted to. Honestly, there aren't that many that come up. We don't have that many conflicts that meet this particular definition. And so that's why many districts don't get into a practice of doing it, and they forget about that log you're talking about.
Okay, and so does it go the other way? Because, you know, there are organizations that give us money and there are organizations that we engage in services. So would it go both ways?
Anything that we enter into an agreement with, any contract, yes. So it could be us receiving as a gift. So let's say some group wants to give us $100,000. Usually there's conditions every time people give us money that we spend the money to do X, Y, and Z. If that group that is giving us money, it has a board member who's also a director of the Kent School District, then they need to identify that conflict to the other board members at the time that business comes before, note it in the minutes, not vote on it, and not influence it. And then we should keep a list of those somewhere. It doesn't come up all that often. There aren't that many, our board members tend not to be being on the boards of groups that or own businesses that we do that much business with. So it's pretty rare, and that's why I think people forget about it.
Okay. And then, you know, because it's like, I will say this, you know, like there was a time in the past when I was on the board when a superintendent was up for renewal, and people with which, leaders of organizations with which we have contracts wrote to the board expressing desire for us to continue employing said superintendent. And to me, that was a conflict of interest and we shouldn't have, you know, it put a tenuous situation for those contracts.
Yeah, that particular example is an interesting one. That would not be a conflict under this particular statute. That might be a political conflict that you think that somebody's advice that they were giving you wasn't to be followed because they had a personal interest in it. That'd be a political judgment to make, that they were personally interested in that particular opinion that they're giving you. But that would not be a case where the district was having a business relationship and that you were being asked as a board member that you would personally benefit. Remember, this whole conflict of interest statute is about a personal benefit financially to a board member.
Okay.
It could also be a personal financial benefit to a superintendent, by the way. This is a law that doesn't just apply to school board members. It also applies to other officers, which includes superintendents. It would include your assistant superintendents. It would also include your principals. We can't be doing business with, I have some of my superintendents who are, you know, very well-established, good trainers. They can't get hired by their school district to provide training because that would be a conflict for them to be supervising that particular contract.
Okay.
But let's say we had a principal, or let's do it as a principal because they're a named officer as well, who wrote a textbook. We couldn't buy the textbook written by one of our principals because they would personally benefit from it. That would be a financial benefit conflict that this law applies to. It would not just be if somebody is politically interested because they would personally benefit as their business. That's not benefiting you as a board member or any of the officers.
Yeah, but it could have some sway on, you know, it just concerns me because especially if it's an organization that gives us money, it could have some sway too. So, I mean, I'm always kind of my little spidey senses perk up. Like the district, you know, just engaged in a contract with, we now have Amazon Business Prime. And then we just had the Bezos Foundation come up and it was like within a week of each other. And so my little corporate brain, Sarbanes-Oxley auditing all the time, just kind of that makes my spidey sense tingle, right?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that's a good clarification here. But we're to make sure we understand this particular act talks about what is personally, beneficially, financially going to benefit a school board member or a public officer.
Okay.
That's that conflict that this law applies to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I've only got a few more minutes left, so I'm going to try to get us out of here on time. As we talked about, there are procedures for disclosing it. We just talked about those, so I won't have to go through them again. You record it in the minutes, and you make sure that you take any votes without that person being involved. There's another statute. It's buried actually in the conflicts of interest chapter, but it's not about conflicts of interest. And this is the one that's just called other prohibited acts. There are certain things that we've always considered them unethical, but they finally wrote them down in our law. The first is giving yourself special privileges or exemptions. You can't vote special privileges for yourself as a board member. You're not supposed to be saying, okay, as a board member, I get something that nobody else can get. No bribes or gifts. You would think that's pretty obvious in the law. And I think by the common law, it's probably true, but we've now written into the law. You can't be accepting financial gifts trying to influence your particular vote on something. No conflicting employment or business, which means you cannot engage, let's say, if you wanted to be a real estate agent and sell real estate to the school district, you can't accept a job where that would be part of your job is to sell real estate to the school district, because that'd be a conflict with your role. And then no breaches of confidentiality. And this is probably the one where we're seeing the most discussion, because people, I think, always thought it was true, but it was never written down, and now it is that it's now a prohibited unethical act for you to breach confidentiality. And that's anything that is provided to you and as a confidential nature. The most common one are things that we're allowed to have executive sessions on. That's a really simple one. If it's being discussed in an executive session that was being done, the public was not allowed to hear that conversation. You as an individual board member cannot release any information that you get out of that executive session. Now, 3 of the 5 of you could vote to release that information, but an individual cannot do so. And that follows you even after you're no longer on the board. So if you learned something in an executive session while you were a board member, you then decide not to run next time and you're no longer a board member, you can't at that point then go and reveal everything from the executive session. This would still prohibit that particular thing. There are other things other than executive sessions that are also confidential. For example, I mentioned earlier student records. For some of your business, you may need to see student records at some point in time, but those are protected by a federal act for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and you can't go and redisclose that to anybody without violating that act. That would also violate this rule. That'd be a breach of confidentiality. Okay, last one I wanted to make sure we cover. There are other sources of ethical duties as well. So even if it's not written in the RCWs, there are 3 I wanted to bring up to you tonight. The first is the common law of fiduciary duty. So even before we had any RCWs about this, our court said that our elected officials still had to act in accordance with the fiduciary duty. And what does that mean? Those of us who are law are familiar with that. It's a term that usually it started in the trustees area. If you think about being a trustee, there are 3 types of duties. Usually I think of when I describe it to somebody, when you're a fiduciary, there's a duty of care, which means you need to faithfully investigate any decisions that you're making. Make sure you don't make decisions that are arbitrary and capricious, because you make very many important decisions. You want to make sure that you have a rational basis for making them. You're not making a decision based on you don't like the color of somebody's hair. You're going to vote against this because they're redheaded. That would be breaking your fiduciary duty, which is to have a rational basis for the decisions. That's the duty of care, that you make any decisions that you make. You also have a duty of loyalty, which is very similar to all those conflicts we were just talking about, but it probably goes beyond just the financial conflicts as well. So it's not engaging in anything that would be competing with the school district or self-dealing, something that would be, benefiting you personally, but not the interests of the organization. So when you think about your duty of loyalty, it's to always think about, my duty is to uphold the interests of the entity, of the school district, not my personal interests. And then duty of good faith is the 3rd kind of fiduciary duty. That's to make sure you've explored all of the options on something. And this is why I think, we provide a lot of background information. There's usually a lot of reports at school board meetings. It's to make sure that you get background information to make wise decisions. And that's an important part of your fiduciary duties, to make sure that you know the options that were available to you and had enough information to make a wise decision. So that's the duty of acting in good faith. So the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, the duty of good faith, that all falls under that common law. And the question is really how to enforce that. And most often where we see this come up, it would be in recall petitions. Somebody's upset with the decision that a board has made and sues the decision. The school board tries to remove the school board members. I found one case, the court didn't actually use the term fiduciary duty, but what it described could be described as the fiduciary duty. And it was a case where a board was told that if they took certain action, it would violate the contract that the district had entered into with somebody. They were told in advance. Nevertheless, 3 board members went out and voted to violate that contract. Then somebody brought a recall petition. The court reviewed that before it goes to the voters. It goes to the court to see, does this constitute misfeasance or malfeasance or a violation of the oath of office? And the court said it did, because the board had been told in advance that taking this vote would violate a contract that the district had already entered into. And by doing so, they created, in that case, about $60,000 of liability for the school district, that violated a common law duty that they had to act in the best interests of the district. And it was then a lawful recall petition that then went to the voters to decide whether or not to keep that particular member in office. It's a Washington State case. I won't embarrass the school district who had to go through with it. Not one of your neighbors pretty far north of you. In addition to the common law fiduciary duty, you also have a board policy 1002. I didn't try to put it on a PowerPoint screen, but I did put a copy of it in the handout materials. Everything that's in your 1002 is listed on bullets there. It is things like being a positive advocate for free public education, working with the staff, students, community to develop an educational system based on the needs of the district. In many ways, when I read all of these, this sounds like the fiduciary duty. The duties that you have put in your board policy 1002, it's all about putting the interests of the school district ahead of your personal interests, ahead of anybody's personal interest. It's the interest of the entity as a whole. And that means sometimes, some things are going to benefit some students over others. You may decide that we have some students who are of greater need than others, and that's a fine decision to make. But you need to make that on behalf of what's best for us as an entity as a whole, not what's best based for me personally. And that's what you would find, I think, in your own Code of Ethics 1002, that board policy. It's very similar to the common law fiduciary duty. But that's something you've imposed on yourself. If you don't like any of those, you need to get 3 people to change it. If you want to add something to those, 3 of you can do it. That's your local board policy. The final area I'll point out is not something that's binding on you, but there is a group, WASDA. You're all familiar with the Washington State School Directors Association. They have come out with a very thick list of recommendations of what standards board members ought to hold themselves to. If I were to summarize all of them, it is about putting the interests of the district, the interests of the community ahead of your personal interests. But if you wanted to go look, it's where I would look, honestly. If I were trying to look at what are the ethical duties of a school board member, this particular group has spent a lot of time writing a thick book as to what those ethical duties look like. And that's where I'd refer you to go look at it. I think you can get a free copy actually on their website if you wanted to see the WASDA standards for board members. But I wanted to give you at least those sources, some background to think about ethical duties that are beyond, for example, the conflicts of interest, the Open Meetings Act. All of those are in law, much clearer, easier for me to give you advice on. But these areas, the common law fiduciary duty, board policy 1002, and the WASDA standards, that'd be another source if you wanted to do more research into board ethics. Okay, I got us right to 7:30. I won't stop, however, without asking one more time, do you have questions you would like to ask? I love answering your questions. I'm not seeing any come open. And just so you know, this is not your last chance to ever ask questions again. You can ask questions later. You can work with either with each other or with your superintendent to get questions. You can go to Paul. You're lucky, one of the very few districts in the state who actually has in-house legal counsel who can advise you. And if he wants any consultation, Paul knows how to get a hold of me as well. Thank you very much for your attention and the participation. I really appreciated people participating tonight. That makes it, I think, a lot more interesting for everybody to know what are the things you actually care about. So thanks for the questions.
And Mr. Porter, I just want to say thank you for a very good 2 hours of individual attention to us. And I think, yes, I did take some of these classes at WASDA, and we've had a few refreshers, but the ability to have such one-on-one questions to go over it thoroughly. I mean, every time I learn something, but tonight I especially appreciate it. And I want to thank Interim Superintendent Bella for arranging and setting this up. I think one of the things that, some of us felt when we became board directors, we needed a lot more help and we didn't get it. And maybe that was because a lot of things were on the plate or other things, but it is my personal desire to make sure we get as much training and help from outside that we can possibly have, and include everybody so everybody gets a chance to be their best. And I do want to thank you so much tonight for your time. And I do believe, if there's no other discussion, that it is now 7:32 and we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.